everybody, my name is Kelly. I'm back for Thrifty Notion to bring you the next video in our Textile Talk series. If you were here last week, you know we talked all about cotton, and I promised you that we'd have a more in-depth video on cotton's sustainability concerns, and that's what we're going to be doing today. So before we start, I just want to preface this by saying, obviously, these are some heavier topics, talking about the sustainability, the environmental and social impacts of conventional cotton cultivation. There's some things about it that really aren't great and aren't great to hear about. We just think it's important to bring light to these issues, and it absolutely should not be on the shoulders of small businesses and consumers to care about these issues, because larger businesses should definitely be prioritizing them, but we do think it's important to talk about them, bring light to them, and just educate on these topics, because at the end of the day, the more consumers care about these things, the more large businesses are going to prioritize them as well. This is the world we live in, and at some point you have to play the game. So speaking of the terrible impacts of consumerism, I just wanted to talk about the 3 pillars of sustainability really quick, because I find it super interesting. So for just a little bit of background, I do have my degree in apparel and textiles, and our department's focus was on sustainability. And that was really intriguing for me because I was already so interested in sustainability, but something I didn't know about it until I was in that program was the fact that sustainability actually has 3 pillars. There's environmental and social pillars to sustainability, but there's also an economic pillar. And after learning that, I was like, well, duh, of course there's an economic pillar. When we're thinking about the sustainability of a business, we're also talking about whether or not it can succeed. We're not just talking about environmental sustainability, which I think is the one that comes to mind for most people first. So for a long time, that environmental piece was what always came to mind for me first. And then I started learning more about the social issues, and that was part of it. But now when I think about sustainability, when we're thinking about it in a broad sense, we're also looking at that economic pillar. And the reason I find that so interesting is because the reason things are so unsustainable is because we're prioritizing the economic pillar over people and over the environment. And so if we can find a way to have that business balance on all 3 pillars, that's how we find true sustainability. So it's not just about the environment, it's not just about people, it's not just about money. We have to be thinking about all 3, because at the end of the day, money matters too. And so, I don't know, I'm getting all excited about that just because I personally find it really interesting, and I think maybe if you didn't know that, that's an interesting thing about sustainability. So, before I geek out too much about that, let's go ahead and talk about the environmental impacts of cotton farming. Cotton is the most widespread non-food crop in the world, but it's much more resource dependent than some other fiber crops like linen and hemp. Cotton requires a large amount of water to be grown, and it is considered drought tolerant, but in most places it's going to require pretty intensive irrigation systems and large amounts of water input into the process to give a desirable result when it comes to those crops. So some resources will try to tell you, oh, it's drought tolerant, so it's not as bad as these people are saying it is, but in order to produce the desired amount of cotton from all the crops, irrigation systems are going to be used and large amounts of water are going to be used, because that's the way to make more money. So basically what I'm saying is cotton requires a lot of water, and even in cases where it doesn't require a lot of water, we're using a lot of water. Not only is water itself a resource, and that water being used is usually being processed, which requires energy, but that large use of water also contributes to soil degradation as it washes away nutrients from the soil. And what it's washing with it, in addition to nutrients from the soil, are also the large amounts of pesticides and fertilizers that are used on cotton crops that are required for growing cotton crops of desirable quality. And so we have all of this excess pesticide and fertilizer washing into rivers, streams, and ultimately lakes. Pesticide runoff is obviously not a good thing, because that's just straight poison going right into our waterways. But one thing that I think is often overlooked is the effect of the fertilizers running off into our waterways as well. So one thing that a lot of people may not know about is nutrient pollution. And this is when we get too much of a good thing, we have too much nitrogen running into our lakes, and when it reaches a still, fresh body of water like a lake, what we're going to be thinking about happening at that point is algae overgrowth and algae blooms. So the crazy thing about these algae blooms is that they're going to be disrupting the entire ecosystem. They're going to keep sunlight from reaching plants below the water surface, and so they will start to die off. They're going to be reducing visibility to things like fish and other organisms in the water, so they're going to have trouble getting around, have trouble feeding. That will start to kill those off as well. And then as the algae dies, it will deplete the oxygen from the water through its breakdown as it rots. And so that's going to start killing off organisms as well. So really start to finish, the algae is doing a number on the ecosystem. And if the proper, normal amount of nitrogen was present in the water, that algae may not have ever bloomed to the extent that it did. And generally speaking, most of the time when an algae bloom happens, it's going to be because of something we as humans on the planet did to increase the presence of nitrogen in the water. So we're not just talking about cotton crops here, right? We're also talking about fabric. So when we're thinking about turning that cotton fiber into fabric, there are a lot of steps involved in this process. There's also a lot more water involved. So there's going to be a lot of emissions produced from the factories in making fabric, and that's of concern, as well as the water usage and the water reprocessing. And then there's also the question of where's that water being dumped, because a lot of times it is being disposed of in improper ways, and that can be poisoning ecosystems and individuals living near the processing facilities as well. So that segues us perfectly into talking about more social issues associated with cotton farming, the first of which, and maybe the most concerning, being the use of child labor. And this is something that happens a lot, especially around harvest time to help with seasonal harvest work, but forced and trafficked labor also occur within this industry and within the agriculture industry in general. It's really concerning too, because kids are often tasked with working around very dangerous equipment or with chemicals like pesticides, and so that can be very concerning and very hazardous. That pesticide use is also just very dangerous in general. When we look at the entire population of agricultural workers around the world with any crop, not just fiber crops, 44% of those people get unintentionally poisoned by pesticides every year, with about 11,000 deaths being caused per year by pesticide poisoning. So this is concerning for the textile industry specifically, because 60% of those deaths are occurring in India, with 62% of India's agricultural workers being unintentionally poisoned every year. So that's higher than the average. And cotton is a very, very pesticide-heavy crop, and it's one of India's leading crops. So, it's one of those which came first, the chicken or the egg kind of situations, but it's looking like, because India is so cotton-heavy on its production, India is one of the countries with the higher rate of unintentional pesticide poisoning, and also one of the places with the highest amount of deaths. It makes you wonder what the connection is, and we don't have clear answers to how much cotton is playing a role in this, but there seems to be some correlation there, and that's concerning. I also will admit I don't have all the numbers for this, because it's something I learned about in school and I don't remember the details, but I do know that there's a lot of instances of people living around cotton farms in countries that have less regulation over their pesticide use that end up getting really sick from pesticide poisoning as well. So I don't know if that's included in these numbers. It sounds like the numbers were related specifically to agricultural workers, but it's also important to think about how people in surrounding areas are being affected by the farming as well. So when talking about these topics, I think it's important to think about what we as consumers can do differently. And the first and most sustainable choice in any situation is always going to be to use what you have. So if you're someone who's sitting on a large fabric stash, before you sew your next project, maybe take a look at that stash and see if there's something that you can use that you already own. The next most sustainable option would be to shop secondhand or dead stock, or to have a swap with your friends. Just getting stuff that's already on the economy, that's already out there, already been produced, is going to be another great way to be sustainable in your purchasing, because at the end of the day, something that already exists is going to be more sustainable than having to produce a new item. So next, when looking at fabric specifically, and especially when looking at cotton, some natural fiber alternatives to cotton are linen and hemp. Those are two crops that take much less resources to grow. They're very sustainable fabric choices, and they are a little bit more expensive, but the thing about that is that the more demand there is, the cheaper they'll eventually be. And I do think that if we had a greater demand for this in the textile world and even in the apparel world, that prices would go down. They're much less resource heavy crops, and so logically you would think they would cost less to grow, but a lot of why cotton is so cheap is because of the scale it's grown at. So more demand means prices go down in the future, and they're also two very durable fabric options as well. So I would definitely recommend looking into linen and hemp more if you haven't done so already. So last but not least, we need to address the elephant in the room, and that would be organic cotton. Organic cotton has been greenwashed. It is not nearly as sustainable as a lot of big brands want you to believe it is, but it is a good alternative to conventionally grown cotton because it does use some less bad inputs into the process. So organic cotton still uses pesticides and fertilizers, but they're just going to be more natural options. So they can still be harmful to the environment, but they're not going to lead to as many issues like the poisonings that we talked about earlier. So organic cotton is a step in the right direction, but it's not solving all the problems. And I will say recycled cotton is another cotton alternative that is going to be a lot better for the environment because it's just reusing something that's already out there and just reprocessing it a little bit. So there's going to be some inputs into the energy aspect of turning it into new fiber and into new fabric, but we're not going to deal with all of the issues associated with the new fiber. And this is a much less common option. You don't see 100% recycled fabrics very often, not 100% recycled cotton at least. So in the race of organic versus recycled versus conventional cotton is the worst, organic cotton is less bad, and recycled cotton is the least bad, but oftentimes you're going to find recycled and organic cotton blended, and that is a great option as well, and I would go for that over pure organic cotton if I had the choice. Alright, you guys, that was a lot of material to cover in a short video, so if you have any questions related to this topic, please leave them in the comments down below. As always, thank you so much for being here. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next time. Happy sewing!